Thanks, Drew, for reading that for me this morning. You know, I've got one pair of steel-toed boots that Chuck gave me, and I had to put them on while I was doing this lesson because I was getting all over my own toes. And hopefully, when I get done, you all will wish you had on steel-toed boots too. But I think it'll be a beneficial lesson to us, and one that we can take home with us. You know, as a Christian, we must be on constant guard with all kinds of evil forces. You know, the Bible tells us that, to constantly be on guard. All kinds of temptations are in this world that lay ahead of us and that we're going to run into from time to time. Some of these things are like bad companionships. We know what those things can lead to. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh. You know, we've all heard these kind of things mentioned. And on and on and on. You know, I could go with a list of the things that we must guard against. But the reason why that I said that this lesson hits home with me personally, and that I hope it does with you too, is because this lesson is about being deceived. And we all can be deceived. But it's not about being deceived by bad companions, which can happen. And it's not about being deceived by the lust of the eyes. We all know that can happen. We get enticed by that and deceived. And it's not even about being enticed and deceived by the prettiness of the flesh. It's not about that. No, it's not about any of those things. You see, the most tragic of all deceptions is when we deceive ourselves. And that's something that we can very easily do, is deceive ourselves. And you know, that deception is more difficult to correct than any of the others. But, just as always, the Bible does not prepare us for that. And the Bible specifically warns us about deceiving ourselves. And I want to look at just a few things this morning that the Bible talks about where we can deceive ourselves. So what does the Bible do for us about this subject? You have been warned. You have been warned not to deceive yourself. Well, the first one I want to look at this morning is we can deceive ourselves by now listen to this, by over-evaluation of our own wisdom. Now, we don't do that. I know I don't ever do that. Surely, y'all wouldn't say, man, you think you know everything. You think you are really smart. Do you ever look at yourself and think, that might be me? I don't have to look very hard for it to see, for me to see that in me. Well, let's look at 1 Corinthians. That's where I want to go to first thing this morning. Turn over to 1 Corinthians, chapter 3, and I'm going to read verses 18 and 19. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, He taketh the wise in their own craftiness. Now, we've read that passage a lot of times, and we've used that passage a lot of times, but I want us to catch what it says in verse 18. Let no man deceive himself. That's important, because you can't blame anybody else for deceiving yourself. That is something that you do. That is something that you do without help of anybody else. You deceive yourself. Well, men have always had the problem of flaunting their own wisdom. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, we all know where it says, trust the Lord and lean not to your own understanding. Lean not to your own understanding. Isn't that amazing? The things that you think you understand, you better not lean on because you might be wrong. That's what that verse is saying. Proverbs 26 and verse 12, it puts it like this. And I don't know how you miss it when it's put like this. Seest thou a man wise in his own conceit? There is more hope for a fool than for him. If we ever think that we are wise, we are being conceited, and there is more help for a fool than for you. If that's where you have gotten to. I don't know how to put it any plainer than that. Well, many people have opinions today, don't they? Man, there's opinions everywhere on every subject you want to think about. And with the ability to communicate with each other today, we thought the telephone was something when that came out, and when you could communicate on the telephone. What about the internet? Boy, you want some opinions, you ain't got to go far, just to your back pocket, and you can say, oh, let's see what they think about this. You can get all the opinions you want. So, everybody's got an opinion. Many people want to shove their opinion right down your throat. Now, I think this is what the Bible is warning us about here, partly when it's talking about do not be deceived, because this is what can happen. And I think this is what's happening some in the world today. Since people are wanting to shove their ideas down your throat, in the nicest way possible now, they're not, they're being nice. But we have to be aware of this because we know deceivers are out there. We know that. We as Christians know that deceivers are out there. But you see, here's what happens. If we don't stand on guard and we let them shove their ideas down our throat, it becomes part of us. And you can relate this to the things that relate to you. It becomes part of us. And then we start to deceive ourselves. We start to form ourselves to be a different person than before we receive this information. It's kind of like witnessing a wreck on the highways. And you really wish you hadn't seen that. Have you ever done that? You saw a bad wreck and you think, boy, I just can't get that out of my mind. I wish I hadn't seen that. We've all pretty much done that. Well, that's what this is like. It's like when people shove these opinions down your throat. If you don't stand on guard and wish you hadn't heard that or wish you hadn't seen that, it becomes part of you and you mold yourself into thinking along these lines, then you start to deceive yourself. So we have to be very careful not to give attention to false ideas because they can become part of us. Do you know what an opinion is? Do you know what the definition of an opinion is, whether it's somebody else's or it's yours? Here it is. A view or judgment formed about something. A view or an opinion, a view or a judgment formed about something. Now that's not too bad if the definition stopped right there. But that's not where the definition stops. The rest of the definition is it's not based on facts or knowledge in most cases. That's what an opinion is. It's what somebody believes about something that's not based on facts or knowledge. That's why everybody's got one. That's why everybody's got an opinion on every subject. So we have to be very careful not to be deceived by things like this. Self-deception can start as being deceived by others. A little bit of this is what I said in the beginning of this, but I just want to show you where it can start. It can start by being deceived by others. Like I said, we swallow it, it's formed wrongly within us, we carry it forward in our own ideas, and then we start to believe it and we're deceived ourselves. So we have to guard against that. Often men think they are wise and that they can calculate all things for themselves. You know anybody like that? They consider themselves wise, and I can calculate things for myself. You know what we call that? We call that your business. You know, well, that's my business. I'll mind my business. You mind your business. You know, that's how we phrase that a lot of times. We can calculate things for ourselves. Well, in Jeremiah 10 and 23, it states there, and this is another passage that we've heard, it is not in man that walketh to direct his own steps. Now you think about how plain that puts that, of how you should be. It is not of you, when you start to walk, to even plan to where you're going to put your foot. Now we can't imagine that. Brother John Ingram really has to think about that a lot with his bad leg. He really has to watch where he steps, coming down a step, or going out the door, or anything. You know, that's something we really think about. God says you're really not even capable of that without me. And we need to remember that, because that's part of the sin that we can fall victim to if we're not careful. And the Bible is warning us about that. Well, let's think just a minute about them that profess to be wise. Think about somebody in your mind. Just get somebody in your mind, if you will, that profess themselves to be wise. Now, I did this to myself. Now, I didn't think about any of y'all. I did this to myself. And you know who come in mind? Politicians. I see a lot of news, and politicians came to my mind when I thought about this, because each and every one of them consider themselves to be wise. And in Romans 1, verses 22 through 25, it says, profess to be wise, you become fools. And it goes on to say later in verse 28 what God thinks about that. When you profess to be wise, it says you become a fool. And later in 28 it says, what does God think about you? It says, it goes on to say later that God gave them over to a reprobate mind. He gave them over to a reprobate mind. Well, what does it mean to have a reprobate mind? First of all, ain't it scary that God gave them over to it? That kind of says, I'm washing my hands of you, you wise fool. I'm giving you over to a reprobate mind. Well, I looked up on the internet at what a reprobate mind. And I looked at, in order for a Christian to have a reprobate mind, what does that involve? What are some warning signs of a reprobate mind? See if this fits in the world today. Number one, and there's a bunch of them, but I'm only going to read 9. The scriptures are they no longer convict you. Means the scriptures, they no longer have any importance to you. Number 2, your own conscience no longer convicts you. You become numb to the things of God. You start losing the ability to discern from right and wrong. Start calling evil good and good evil. Have ignored the voice of God so long that the voice of the Holy Spirit is on mute in your life. The Word of God is no longer the final authority in your life. It has lost its value in your life, and you do what you feel is right versus what God's Word states. Starts to believe a lie as a truth and walks in strong deception. Starts making excuses for the way you are. The desire to please God is no longer there, and you only strive to please yourself. Does that sound like a politician? Does that sound like the world we live in today? That the good has become evil and the evil has become good? God warned. politicians of this. The warning was there for them. I'm not condemning them all. But Republican, Democrat alike, a lot of them go down this road. And we have to be very careful not to follow them. When we feel that anything that we do is on this list, this is a warning sign that you're starting to deceive yourself. You see, the Bible tells us that a person must become a fool. What does that mean? It says that a person must realize that he actually knows very little. Can you sit there in a pew this morning and think of yourself and understand that you actually know very little? And that makes you wise when you know that. That makes you wise. Now that's kind of a brain twister. But it says to be acceptable to God, that's a way that you have to be. And that's found in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 18. And you know, this can be such a strong force in your life that men often think that they are wise enough to plot their own course in religion. They don't need the Bible anymore. They certainly don't need all the Bible anymore to plot their own way in religion. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Now that's been stated a lot of times from pulpits. And that's found in Proverbs 16 and verse 25. But think about it this morning. There's a way that seemeth right unto a man. So you can physically think that you are right. Physically think that you are right. But all that you are doing is digging your own eternal grave. So you've got to do more than think you are right. You've got to search the scriptures and make sure you are right. Now, we wish people would do that on any subject. You know, find out the facts. Make sure what you're saying is right. And I wish we all would too. But I'll tell you one thing. The Bible warns us that we better do it when it comes to your soul. You better make sure that what you've always heard, what you've always believed, is what is in the Bible and that it is right. So we better be doing that. Because if we don't, we deceive ourselves. Well, we also deceive ourselves by being hearers only. Hearers only. Let's turn over to the book of James, and we're going to read pretty close to where Drew was reading this morning. The book of James. And in chapter 1, verses 22 through 25, I'm going to read that. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. Now I wanted to read that, because I wanted you to catch verse 22. Deceiving your own self. So if you are a hearer of the word, and that's all, that's where it stops. You're deceiving yourself. But we certainly all, and have heard it a lot of times, about looking into a mirror. You just got out of bed, your hair's on every side of your head, going all kinds of ways. You're completely disheveled. Ladies don't have on any makeup. And if we do that, we look at everything. That's me. And just go on, and we don't have to correct any of it. We all understand that's no good. Well, that's what's a shame, is we can do the same thing right here. We can open those doors back there every time those doors open. We can come in and we can sit on this pew. And more than that, we can listen to every word that is preached. But if we don't do something about what we hear and apply it to each and every one of our own lives, we're not doing any more than wearing out the door. We're just wearing out the door. And I don't mean that to be harsh, but that's what the Bible is telling us. You come in here, you walk through the door, you sit down, you listen to every word. What is it saying? You looked in the mirror. You heard the words. You heard what was said. You knew what you were doing wrong. And you got up and left and didn't correct the thing. That's what he's telling us. You just wearing out the door. Polishing the pews with your hands in. That's all you do. You better do more than that. You better do more than that. Only those who do the will of God will be saved. Only those that do the will of God. And that's what's doing more. That's what you have to do more, is to do the will of God. And that's found in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 27. We must not only hear, but we must obey and become a Christian. You can't keep going on hearing the Word and hearing the Word and hearing the Word and not doing something about it. If you are not a Christian, you've got to do something about it. If you are an erring Christian and you haven't been living your life right, you've got to do something about it, not just continue to hear the Word. You know, I can remember growing up, I'd be sitting on the couch, maybe watching Gilligan's Island or something like that, that was popular back at that time. And I remember Mom, would stick her head around the corner and she'd say, Scott, you need to do so-and-so. Well, 30, 45 minutes later, the second episode of Gilligan's Island was on and I was watching it. And Mom would stick her head back around the corner and she'd say, son, I appreciate you listening to me because I know you heard me, but you better get to getting. And she meant it was time to quit just listening to what I said, get up off that couch and do what I told you. Well, God's kind of telling us the same thing. You're learning what you need to do. You know where you are. Time is running out. You better get to getting. Because none of us know when our time is going to end, when our time is going to be up. And we can't blame anybody else for it because we've deceived ourselves. I don't know what your deception is. Maybe you've deceived yourself that you've got a lifetime yet to go. Man, I've got a whole lot of time to get this thing worked out. Well, there's a lot of young people in the graveyard that's already different. There might be your reason for deceiving yourself might be, well, it don't apply to me. Well, let me tell you, it applies to everybody. It applies to everybody. We deceive ourselves by thinking we are stronger than we are. You ever done that? You ever deceived yourself by thinking you're stronger than you are? Well, the Bible talks about that just a little bit in Galatians 6 and verse 3. And it says there, for if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Again, he warns us about deceiving ourselves. If you think you are something when you are nothing, you deceive yourself. God, right there, is telling you that when it comes to the godly head, and you are nothing. You are nothing. Now, we're the luckiest race anywhere because God values. Even though in reality we are nothing compared to God, He values us immensely. And that's another lesson for another time. But understand that God values you even though you are nothing. He doesn't value you because you are something. He values you because you are nothing. And that's a frame of mind that we have to have. We always have to remember there is no comparison between God and us. We need to have a humbleness of mind. Colossians 3 and verse 12 tells us exactly that we have to have a humble mind. Pride is a strong deceiver. Proverbs 18 and verses 10 to 11 talks about pride. Do you know what conceit means? The definition of conceit is an excessive appreciation of one's own work. Of one's own work. I know you all have heard the expression, I'd love to buy you for what you think I'd love to buy you for what you're worth and sell you for what you think you're worth. That's true. That's the truth. And that is not humbleness of mind. If we're like that, or we know somebody like that, they're not demonstrating humbleness of word. Well, I know none of us in here remember the 20s. But we might remember some things about history of the 20s, 1920s. They called it the Roaring 20s. Man, everything was good. Everything was possible. It was, remember, we just come off the Titanic sinking, and where, everything was great. Even God himself couldn't sink the ship, and the ship sunk, and all this. Everything was good going into the 20s. Man, everything was good. Well, you remember who ran for president in the 1920s? 1928, in fact. It was Herbert Hoover run for president, and he was one of the only presidents to ever run, and his means of running, was how good things were. How good things are. And I'm going to keep that wheel rolling. I'm going to keep it going. And he would pound the podium, and he would say, this country is triumphing over poverty. Poverty is going away. The poorhouse is no more. That was one of the things he said. The poorhouse is no more. Poverty is going to be completely done away with under my term in office. And you know what? The people took it. They did it. They swallowed it. He won by a landslide. What happened in 1929? Stock market crashed. We entered the Great Depression. Now you think about the scenes that you've seen, pictures of the Great Depression. Your poorhouse was gone. Poverty was gone. Old Herbert Hoover was right. It couldn't get any better. No. For the next 10 years, man was in the worst situation that this country's ever seen. Now, to me, that sounds like the hand of God a little bit. Sounds like the people of that time might have been deceived a little bit. So we need to think about that. We could be as wrong as Herbert Hoover and the people of 20s were, that things are so good. Things are so good. We deceive ourselves. This is one that we really have to watch. And one that we probably don't think about. We can deceive ourselves by not bridling our tongue. We really didn't think about that. We can deceive ourselves by what we say. Well, what Drew read for us this morning, the warning that God was given there in James 1, that was given to a Christian. They were talking to brothers and sisters there. All these gifts that God has given you, don't deceive yourself that these are just an endless flow. God was warning the Christian there. In James, he had already shown that hearing without doing doesn't profit us anything. He had already shown that. And then he goes on to show, if you read on your own, past where Drew read, he shows that doing, physically doing what you're supposed to do, without controlling your tongue, then your whole worship is in vain. You can follow every step that I told you to do, people. God would say. But if you can't bridle that tongue of yours, everything you do is in vain. The misuse of the tongue is one of man's greatest and widespread weaknesses. Let's look at James 3. James 3, verses 2 and 6. James 3, verses 2 through 6 says, "For if there come unto you a sinful man with a gold ring and godly apparel," James 3, verses 2 through 6. "For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Behold also the ships, which though they be so great, and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small hand, whithersoever the governor listeth. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold how great a matter a little fire kindleth. For the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell." Does that sound like something that I need to think about very often? Does that sound like something that ain't very important? Sounds like something we ought to have written on the wall, don't it? To constantly remind us about the tongue. Well, look what he says back up there. And think about that, about how the tongue is. And you know, you can't talk about the tongue really without talking about gossip. Gossip is a terrible thing. If you've ever been the subject of gossip, you know how bad it is. And all of us have been the subject of gossip. And all of us know those situations. Well, the Bible talks a lot about that. It says that gossip perpetuates lies. That's in Proverbs 16 and 27. Gossip assassinates character. That's in Proverbs 18 verse 8. Gossip stirs up strife. That's in Proverbs 26, 20 through 22. Gossip reveals a lack of brotherly love. And that's in Proverbs 11 and 13. Gossip destroys friendship. That's in Proverbs 16 and 28. Remember, we just read in James 3 and 2. What did it say? If you can control your tongue, if you can control your tongue, you can control your whole body. Therefore, it's saying it's the hardest thing to control of your whole body. But if you can do it, what does it say? You would be, in essence, a perfect man. A perfect man. So that leads you to believe we can almost blame every sin, everything that is done, everything that has occurred throughout history that is wrong on the tongue. Some form of the use of the tongue has been man's downfall. Should we take that lightly and not think about it very often? No, we better think about it a lot. And we better examine ourselves and make sure that we are having control of that tongue as best as we can. I said this lesson hits home with me, and I said it would be hit home with you because it had to do with deception. But I said that because it has to do with self-deception. I had to put on my steel-toed boots because I was thinking about self-deception. And if you listened to the lesson this morning, you probably needed steel-toed shoes too because you're thinking of yourself and the way that you deceive yourself. So, in other words, we should regard ourselves in many respects as our own worst enemy. Now, you know how you avoid your enemies. You know how you act around your enemies. And you know how cautious you are when you have to be around your enemies. Well, you know what? You've got to be around yourself. So the Bible says you better be on guard. And you better be cautious of yourself. Because it's the strongest deceiver. Self is the only person that can separate us from God. That's power. Ourselves is the only thing that can separate us from God. When we recognize self as a potential deadly enemy, it causes us to be on guard. It causes us to think about it. It causes us not to listen to everything this old brain comes up with. In closing this lesson, I want to leave you with this thought. We are nothing without each other. We know that, and have been taught that for years. We are nothing as individuals without each other, our brothers and sisters in Christ. Well, how much further is it that we are nothing without God? If another human Christian being can make value to us, how much value does God add? In essence, He adds it all. He adds it all. So if you're here this morning and you are not a Christian, how close are you to that reprobate mind? How close are you? If you're here this morning and you have sinned and you have not brought that before the people because it has brought shame upon the church, you are forming deception of yourself that you have time in the future to do that. Or maybe that it's not that important. You deceive yourself. It's time to make something work, to do something about it, and to make it right before it's everlasting too late. We're here this morning to help you in any way